The quiet zone alarm runs on a 3-second pulse. Low, even, calibrated not to startle the sentinels into a targeting posture. I had heard it so many times over 11 years at Verath Station that it had stopped sounding like an alarm at all and started sounding like weather, just another condition of the air, something you noted and moved on from. The morning it mattered, I was in the documentation annex running transit manifests when the pulse changed pitch. Not louder, sharper. That particular register meant a compact enforcement team had activated the inner perimeter, which meant a raid had either just finished or was still concluding in the cargo bays. I set down my stylus, which is what I did when there was nothing else useful to do, and I waited. The manifests in front of me were the usual tangle. Verath Station sat at the junction of 3 transit lanes on the outer edge of what the compact called its administrative boundary, which was a bureaucratic way of saying it was the last place where compact law was the only law. Beyond the boundary, the lanes were contested. Inside it, the compact was absolute. The station processed between 300 and 400 beings per standard cycle: refugees, workers, registered migrants, cargo manifests, and every one of them moved through my annex in some form or another, as paper or as data or as a problem I was handed to resolve. I had been a border transit logistics runner before I was a clerk, and before that I had been a dock worker on a compact adjacent freight platform, and before that I had been young enough to think that institutions were built to help people rather than to manage them. By the morning the alarm changed pitch, I had not thought that in a long time. I had methodology instead, which is a reasonable trade. Verath was not an attractive posting. The station was functional, well-maintained, reasonably staffed, bureaucratically important, but it had the quality of a room where the window faces a wall. Everything significant happened on the other side of the boundary. The uncontrolled lanes, the independent settlements, the frontier worlds that the compact was slowly digesting. Verath sat at the threshold and processed the digestion. The beings who came through us were, for the most part, people the larger machinery had already decided something about. My job was to confirm what the machinery had decided, or to find the place where the machinery's decision was incorrect. The raid had targeted a trafficking cell operating out of Base 7. I learned this from compliance officer Ren Davesh, who came to my window at the annex 40 minutes after the alarm, carrying a datapad and the expression of a man who has found a problem he does not want to own. Davesh was career compact, crisp collar, annexation pin on the lapel, the careful flatness of someone who has learned to read the hierarchy before he speaks. We had a functional relationship built on mutual usefulness. He brought me the documentation problems he could not resolve by force, and I resolved them. I did not like him and he did not like me, and we both understood this and had arranged our cooperation around it the way you arrange furniture around a structural column. You work with it because it is not going anywhere. Over 11 years I had come to understand him reasonably well, which is not the same as liking him. He was not cruel. He was not corrupt. He was something that in some ways I found harder to work around. He was precise, and his precision was in the service of a system that he believed in completely, because he had never been required to stand on the wrong side of it. He set the datapad on the counter between us and tapped it once. "Base 7 is cleared," he said. "Cells scattered. 3 detained, 2 fled into the quiet zone, presumed handled by the sentinels." He said this without inflection. The sentinels' handling of beings who entered the quiet zone uncleared was a known outcome, and everyone at Verath Station had learned to describe it the same way in the passive voice, as if the quiet zone acted on its own and no one had programmed it. The cargo manifest is a wreck. We have 17 beings in processing, all with at least partial documentation, one exception. He turned the datapad so I could read it. The exception was logged as follows. Designation, unknown, species, Velhari unverified, chip status, none, file status, none. Movement authorization, none. Classification unclassified. Age estimate small/subadult. Current location corridor 4G, seated, non-responsive to relocation requests. I looked at the entry for a long time. Non-responsive to relocation requests, I said. She sat down in the corridor and she won't move. She's not distressed. She's just sitting. He said it as if this were an operational failure on the child's part. She has no chip, no file, no transit record anywhere in the system. As far as compact records are concerned, she does not exist. She's sitting in corridor 4G, I said. She exists. Davesh did not appreciate the distinction. She is unclassified vein. Under Section 14, Compact Administrative Code, an unclassified organic presence within the administrative boundary with no movement authorization is subject to immediate orderly removal. I am required to initiate the removal process within 6 standard hours of identification. Removal to where? Holding depot on Second Station while classification is attempted. If classification cannot be established within 48 hours, the holding depot processes them under general provision. General provision was a term I knew. It meant the compact would hold an unclassified being in a temporary facility, where they would remain indefinitely without legal standing, without advocacy rights, without any mechanism for release, because you cannot release someone whose existence the system has not confirmed. A being processed under general provision did not go anywhere. They simply stayed in a numbered berth in a numbered facility, until the numbers changed in some administrative way that the compact would arrange on its own schedule, for its own reasons. I had seen the end point of general provision 3 times in 11 years. Once in a report, once in a filing I had to process, once when a being I had been trying to help arrived at that outcome before I could stop it. That last time had been 7 years ago, and I had not been able to make myself forget it. She was small. She was sitting in a corridor alone. She had no chip. "Give me the 6 hours," I said. Davesh looked at me with the particular expression of a man who has just decided to make something someone else's problem. It is a look I had seen on his face before, and I was grateful for it, because it meant he would not stand in my way for the next 6 hours. He was willing to hand me rope if I chose to hang myself with it. 6 hours, he said. After that I initiate removal. You have until, he checked the datapad, 1400. He left. I put on my jacket and walked to corridor 4G. She was sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up, a small ashen lilac shape in the dim light of the service corridor. The Velhari are a long-skulled people, gracile bones, wide silver eyes that pick up light the way still water does, ears that come to a point at the upper rim. Their skin has a faint undertone that shifts with temperature. In the cold of the corridor, hers was more gray than lilac, the color of weathered stone in early morning. She was wearing an oversized maintenance smock that someone, probably a member of the cell, had put on her at some point, because it was several sizes too large, and the sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, and the hem came nearly to her feet. In her hands she held a small carved wooden bird. It was rough work, the kind of carving a person does with a utility knife and patience rather than skill. The wings were asymmetrical, the beak a little too blunt, but she held it with both hands as if it were a credential. I crouched down to her eye level. I did not speak immediately. In my experience with Velhari, and I had dealt with Velhari transit cases before, the correct first move is to make yourself small and legible. They process threat assessments through a combination of posture and scent, and a human crouching rather than standing reads as non-predatory. I had learned this from a Velhari cargo rights advocate named Oram Dast, who had come through Varath 4 years earlier on a transit dispute, and who had explained the basics of Velhari nonverbal communication to me one evening in the station canteen, with the resigned thoroughness of someone who has explained the same things to many humans, and expects them to get most of it wrong anyway. I had tried hard not to get it wrong. Her silver eyes moved to my face. She looked at me the way a person looks at a door they are deciding whether or not to open. "I'm not going to move you anywhere right now," I said. "My name is Tollis. I work in documentation. I do paperwork. Do you understand me? Can you understand compact standard?" A pause. Then the smallest movement of her head, a tilt rather than a nod, which is a Velhari affirmative. "Good, I have 6 hours to help you. That's not very long, but I've worked in faster windows. I need to ask you some things." I sat down on the floor of the corridor, which put me lower than her. The floor was cold and gritty with the particular grime of a service passage that gets cleaned on a rotation rather than as needed. It didn't matter. "Do you have a name?" She looked at me for a very long time. The carved bird turned once in her hands. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a directed breath, almost no volume at all, just the shape of the sound arriving in the air between us. "Sarath." "Sarath?" I repeated it back to her the way she had said it, with the stress at the front. "I'm going to write that down. It's going to go on a form. That form is going to say you exist. Do you understand what I mean by that?" Another tilt of the head. "Good," I said. "Come with me." She did not come immediately. She looked at the carved bird in her hands, looked at me, and then stood all in one deliberate motion, the way that beings who have learned to conserve energy move, not because they are slow, but because they have become economical. She tucked the bird against her chest with one hand and walked beside me without another word. I put her in my supply room, which was a windowless space adjacent to the annex crowded with archive boxes, and a folding cot that I kept there for the cycles when transit backlogs ran through the night. The cot had a blanket and a flat pillow and was not comfortable, but it was private and warm, and it had a door that locked from the inside, which I showed her, pressing the catch twice so she understood how it worked. I gave her a ration bar from the shelf, which she accepted and examined carefully before eating with the methodical attention of someone very hungry who has decided not to show it. I gave her a second blanket from the cot, which she pulled around her shoulders without being asked. Then I went to work. I have tried since to explain to people who were not documentation specialists what the next several hours felt like. The closest I can get is this. Imagine a locked building, very large, built over several centuries by people who added rooms without always remembering what the old rooms were for. And you have a key that fits one lock in the building, but you are not sure which one or where it is, and every minute you spend looking is a minute the building's automated systems are moving things around. That is what working inside the compact administrative code is like when you are trying to do something the code has not anticipated. The compact had not anticipated Sarath because the compact did not anticipate children who fell through raids on trafficking cells. It anticipated cargo. It anticipated registered migrants. It anticipated unauthorized border crossings by adults with incomplete documentation. It had a form for nearly every situation that involved a being with some fragment of a legal identity, a chip, a species registration number, a previous transit record from any compact-adjacent jurisdiction, a family member with standing who could file on their behalf, anything. Sarath had none of it. What she had was a name I had given her on a provisional intake form, the word of a documentation clerk that she was Velhari, and a carved wooden bird. I started with species registration. Velhari were a recognized species under the Compact Interspecies Charter, which meant there was a legal definition for them, which meant I could formally file a species identification without a chip scan, provided I had 2 qualified witnesses and a physical descriptor form. I had the physical descriptor form. I had all the forms. I had been collecting forms the way some people collect debts, not because I anticipated needing each one, but because I had learned that the form you need is always the one you don't have, and I had decided years ago not to be caught without. And I had one qualified witness in myself, as a grade 4 documentation officer, which the code considered sufficient for preliminary attestation. I needed a second. I went to the med station and found Healer Prin, a compact and unhurried Titian woman who had been running the station's medical annex for longer than I had been at Verath. She was nobody's friend and everybody's resource. She had a posture of permanent mild impatience with everything that was not her work, and she brought to her work an attention that I recognized from my own approach, because it was the same, total, methodical, complete. I explained the situation in 3 sentences. She looked at me over the rims of the reading glasses she wore, even though her vision was medically corrected, because she said the frames helped her think. "You have until 1400, she said, as if this were a challenge she found professionally interesting rather than hopeless. 1300 at this point, I said. She removed the glasses, set them in her pocket, and walked with me to the supply room without further comment. She examined Sarath with the impersonal thoroughness of someone doing a job: height, weight by estimation, species markers, general health indicators, while Sarath sat on the cot and allowed it with the same quality of patient stillness she brought to everything. "Velhari," Prin said. "Subadult. No visible modification, no chip implantation site." She said this last part in a tone that made it clear she found the absence of a chip implantation site in a subadult Velhari to be correct and the expectation of one to be offensive. She signed the form, handed it back to me, and left without another word. Later, over the following months, she would come by twice weekly. She never once commented on any of it except medically. That was her way of being on the right side of something. That was one wall down. Species registration alone did not give Sarath legal standing. It gave her a box in the compact's taxonomy, which was different. To have legal standing, she needed a classification, a category within the taxonomy that carried rights. The categories for recognized species subadults were: registered dependent, required a registered primary; provisional transit minor, required a movement authorization already in process; pending family reunification case, required an open reunification file; or unaccompanied minor in compact care, which meant the compact took custody, which was not what I intended because the compact's custody of unaccompanied minors led, in my experience and in the experience of everyone who had watched the process, to the same place as general provision, just with different paperwork on the way there. None of these fit. I sat at my desk in the annex and read the administrative code from Section 7 through Section 22, which I had read before but not with this particular problem in mind. I read it looking for the thing I half remembered from a training material I had studied during my logistics runner years, from the period 2 years before the annexation, when the border protocols had been different, and the compact had been absorbing frontier territories faster than its administrative machinery could process them. There had been, in that period, a set of legacy provisions written to handle the administrative chaos of rapid annexation, provisions that had served their purpose and been forgotten without being repealed, because the compact's code was too large and too old for anyone to track every corner of it. I was almost certain one of those provisions was in Section 7. The clock on the wall said 10:40. I had 3 hours and 20 minutes. The code was organized chronologically within each section, oldest provisions first, most recent last. Most practitioners read backward. They started with current law because current law was usually what applied. I read forward. I started at the beginning of Section 7, and I read every subsection and every clause, including the ones that were clearly obsolete, including the ones that referenced administrative structures that no longer existed, including the ones written in the formal language of the early compact, which was stilted and dense, and required a particular habit of mind to parse. I had that habit. It was what 11 years of reading forms had built. I found it at 1114, buried in a pre-annexation subsection labeled 7 Delta that nobody had touched in 23 years. The clause had been written during the rapid annexation period by some administrator, whose name appeared in the authorship block and whom I had never heard of, and whom I would think about for years afterward, who had written into the code a provision that said, in the formal language of that era, in cases where a subadult being of a recognized species is found within the administrative boundary without movement authorization, without registered primary, and without prior compact record, and where said being can be demonstrated to have been resident within the administrative boundary for a period of no fewer than 6 standard hours prior to formal identification, a documentation officer of grade 3 or above may invoke provisional residency status on behalf of said being, which shall grant a period of 90 standard days for classification proceedings to be conducted, during which time no removal action may be initiated. 6 standard hours prior to formal identification. I checked the raid log. The sentinels had flagged base 7 at 0422. Davesh had come to my window at 0640. Between those times, his log noted that the child had been observed in corridor 4G, non-responsive, for an undetermined period. But the timestamp on the first sentinel notation of her presence, a passive proximity log, not an active identification, because the sentinels only actively identified beings who were moving through a flagged zone, and a small being sitting still in a service corridor registered as environmental rather than as a person of interest, showed her in corridor 4G from 0451. From 0451 to 0640 was 1 hour and 49 minutes, not 6 hours. I sat with that for a moment. Then I looked at the provision again, specifically at the phrase prior to formal identification, and I thought about what formal identification meant under the code. It did not mean noticed. It did not mean logged. It meant formally identified. That is, the moment when a compliance officer entered her into the system as an identified unclassified presence and assigned her the status that triggered the removal clock. That moment was 0640. The passive proximity log, the sentinel's notation of a small warm body in a service corridor, was not identification. The sentinel had not been looking for beings. It had been monitoring movement patterns for the raid. The log was a byproduct, an artifact of the passive scanning, not an identification event. The formal identification timestamp was 0640. 6 hours prior to 0640 was 0040. The raid had begun at 0422. The cell had been in Bay 7. Bay 7 connected to Corridor 4G through a service hatch that I had walked past several hundred times. A small child who had been kept in a cargo hold, who had been living in conditions that required her to understand the layout of her immediate environment in the way that beings in precarious situations learn to understand things, quickly, quietly, with the precision of survival, would know that the service corridor was safer than the bay. She could have moved into that corridor the moment she heard the raid beginning, or she could have moved there hours before, in the dark, in the middle of the station's sleep cycle, because the service corridors at 0000 were empty and the cargo bays were not. I could not prove it. The passive proximity log showed 0451. Before that, there was no log because the sentinel had not been scanning that corridor before the raid activated. But the code's evidentiary standard for enforcement log discrepancies was specific. Ambiguities in enforcement logs must be resolved in favor of the registered party. She was not yet a registered party, but I was about to file the species registration, which would make her one. And the moment she was a registered party, the code's evidentiary standard applied retroactively to all logs pertaining to her case. This was not a trick. It was the code working exactly as written. The administrator who had drafted the evidentiary standard had presumably intended it to protect beings with records from enforcement errors in those records. They had not intended it to apply to a child with no prior record at all, but they had not excluded that application, and the code said what it said. I pulled up the form for Provisional Residency Clause 7 Delta. It was the original version from 23 years ago, slightly yellowed at the digital margins in the archival system, never updated because nobody had ever used it. I filled in every field with the precision of a man who has been doing this for 11 years and knows where the errors that invalidate a form live. The fields that must be dated in standard rather than local notation. The fields that require a witness attestation reference number rather than a name. The fields where a single character error will trigger an automated rejection. I listed myself as the invoking documentation officer, grade 4, which was above the required grade 3. I listed the timestamp discrepancy and filed it as a factual ambiguity under the code's own evidentiary standard, which required resolution in favor of the registered party. I noted that as of this filing, Sarath was the registered party, per species registration form 7 Velhari SD filed at 0853 this date. I attached the species registration form as Exhibit 1. I attached Healer Prin's witness attestation as Exhibit 2. I attached a full copy of the passive proximity log as Exhibit 3, with the relevant timestamps highlighted and the ambiguity notation filled in correctly in all fields. Then I filed it. The system accepted it without rejection. I sat and looked at the confirmation screen for a long moment. I had expected an automated rejection on some procedural technicality because the compact system was effective at finding procedural technicalities when it wanted to, and it had very good reasons to want to in this case. The confirmation carried a case number and a processing date and the designation active in the compact's clean institutional font. Active. I looked at that word for longer than I needed to. Then I got up and went to the supply room. Sarath was sitting on the cot with the blanket around her shoulders and the carved bird in her lap, looking at nothing in particular with the quality of patience that I had already noticed and would come to know well. It was not the patience of resignation, not the stillness of a being that has stopped expecting anything. It was the patience of a being that has learned to wait with its attention intact, which is a different thing entirely and much harder. She looked at me when I opened the door. I filed a form, I said. It gives you 90 days here while we work on your permanent classification. Nobody can move you during those 90 days. I paused. Do you understand? The tilt of the head, then quietly with the air of someone establishing facts. The bird ones don't fly. In the hold. It took me a moment. She meant the carved bird. She was explaining it to me that she had been given it or found it or made it, and it did not fly as opposed to real birds which did. She was telling me something about the hold she had come from, about what she had thought about while she was in it, and she was telling me by reference rather than directly, which was a Velhari approach to communication and which I was just beginning to understand. No, I said, this one doesn't. I looked at it. The carving was rough and the proportions were wrong, and whoever had made it had not been much of a woodworker, but they had made a bird and not anything else. It's still a bird. She looked at it for a moment. Yes, she said. It is. I left her to rest and went back to my desk. The clock said 11:52. I had 2 hours and 8 minutes left on Davish's deadline, but the deadline no longer mattered. The filing had superseded it, and I knew it, and when Davish came back at 12:40 he would know it too. He stood at my window with the datapad, and with an expression that had moved from problem-handing to something harder and more focused. He had seen the filing. The system had automatically notified him as the initiating compliance officer, and he had read it carefully enough that, when he arrived at my window, he came not with anger but with specific objections, which told me he was taking it seriously, which was appropriate. Clause 7 Delta, he said. It's in the code, I said. It was written 23 years ago. Nobody has invoked it in at least 20 years. It was never repealed. I checked the full legislative record. There's no repeal action, no amendment, no supersession notation. It's current law. The timestamp discrepancy is not evidence of 6-hour residence. It's a logging artifact from the RAID sensors. It's an ambiguity in an enforcement log, I said. The code resolves ambiguities in enforcement logs in favor of the registered party. She's the registered party per species registration form filed at 0853. I filed clause 7 delta at 1122. Both are in the case file. I tap the counter between us. You can challenge the filing. You have 30 days to file an evidentiary objection with the Administrative Review Board. If you do, the board will examine the log, the filing, and my supporting exhibits and make a determination. That process takes between 60 and 90 days under current board scheduling. During that entire process, no removal action can be initiated because the filing is active. I let him work through the arithmetic. She has 90 days from today. The review process, if you initiate it, will run until approximately day 90. The board will issue a determination at approximately the moment the provisional period expires. At that point, you would need to initiate a second filing to proceed with removal. But she will have been resident here for 90 days, which allows me to argue continuity of residence under a different provision, which resets the clock under a different mechanism. Davesh looked at me for a long moment. His face had the careful neutrality of a man deciding how much of what he is thinking to say out loud. You're building a paper wall. I'm using the compact's own code, I said. Every word of it, every provision correctly applied. If you find a section I've applied incorrectly, file the objection and I'll respond to it. I met his eyes. I have read more of the administrative code than anyone on this station, possibly more than anyone in this sector. Every form I filed today is exactly correct. You can spend the next 90 days trying to find the error that isn't there, or you can spend them on something that has one. He picked up the data pad. He looked at it. Then he set it back down with a kind of finality that told me he had made his decision, and it was not, at least for today, to fight. She'll need classification before the provisional period ends, he said. 90 days doesn't make her permanent. I know, I said. That's what the 90 days are for. He left. I went back to work. The next 87 days were the hardest documentation work I have ever done, and I have done documentation work in 3 border crises and 2 administrative overhauls. The problem was not any single barrier. It was the sequence, the way each solved problem opened into 3 more, the way every piece of evidence I needed had to be constructed from first principles because Sareth had no prior records anywhere in any system the compact recognized. She had not come from a compact world. She had come from somewhere the compact had not yet formally annexed, which meant her species registration was valid, but her origin jurisdiction was not recognized, which meant I had to find the provision that extended species rights to beings from non-compact jurisdictions, which existed, buried in a trade agreement annex from 15 years ago, because the compact had needed to allow Velhari merchants to do business inside the boundary without extending them full citizenship. And the mechanism they had created for that purpose was close enough to what I needed that I could argue it extended to subadults from Velhari majority non-compact settlements. I argued it. The first automated review rejected it on a technical ground I had expected. I filed a clarification. The clarification was accepted. Every 3 or 4 days, Davesh sent a formal query, an evidentiary challenge, a procedural clarification request, a referral to the regional compliance coordinator, which was a step above his authority, and told me he had escalated the case to someone who would bring a different quality of opposition. I answered every query with the precision and patience of a man who had arranged his other work to free up the hours, because by that point I had arranged exactly that my regular transit caseload was being covered by a junior clerk named Wesson, who was 26 years old and alarmed by me after the first week, and who covered the regular work capably enough that I could spend every available hour on Sareth's file. She stayed in the supply room. I moved the archive boxes to a far corner and brought in a second lamp and a small table and a chair. The canteen cook, a large and quiet man from a frontier world named Oba, appeared at my annex door on the second morning with a covered tray, and left it without commentary, and continued to do so twice daily thereafter. Healer Prin came by on a set schedule, examined Sarath, signed whatever health attestations the file currently required, and left. The station's maintenance supervisor, an older woman named Gret who had been at Varath longer than anyone, began leaving small items in the supply room without explanation. A better blanket, a set of reading materials in Velhari script that she had sourced from somewhere, a pair of proper station-issue shoes in approximately the right size. Nobody announced these things, they simply happened. Sarath was not talkative. The Velhari are a precise people, and they communicate a great deal through posture and proximity rather than words, and after the first week, I had begun to learn her vocabulary of adjustments. When she angled herself toward the door, it meant she wanted to walk, and I took her walking in the late evenings when the transit corridors were quiet, and the station's population was reduced to the overnight shift, the two of us moving through the longer loops in silence while she looked at things with her wide silver eyes and processed them in whatever way she processed things, with the same total attention she brought to everything, nothing casual, nothing dismissed. When she set the carved bird on the table, it meant she was thinking about something that made her tired. When she held it in both hands, she was all right. On the 31st day, she asked me where I was from. We were walking the outer loop, which ran along the observation panels that looked out onto the quiet zone, the flat, machine-policed corridor of monitored space that lay between the station's outer hull and the beginning of the uncontrolled lanes. The sentinels moved in their slow, repeating patterns out there, silver and indifferent, their scanning lights making long sweeps across the empty ground. A frontier settlement, I said, about 40 light minutes from here. It was annexed about 15 years ago. Before that it was just a town. People farming several varieties of things that grew in poor soil, building structures that would last, not much of anything by compact standards. Do you go back? No. She looked at the sentinels through the glass. The light from the quiet zone lay blue and even across her face. Why not? I thought about how to answer that honestly. When a place gets annexed, it doesn't stop existing, I said. The buildings are still there, the people are still there, but it stops being what it was. The rules change. The people who ran it lose the authority they had. It becomes part of something larger, and the larger thing manages it according to principles that were written somewhere else by people who never saw it. It's not worse in every way. Sometimes the infrastructure improves. Sometimes there's more medicine. But the thing it was, the particular way it organized itself, the particular logic it had, that goes. And I find it easier to be here, where I know the rules of the larger thing well enough to use them, than to be there where everything I knew already became something else. She was quiet for a while. The sentinels moved through their patterns. You use the rules, she said, because you know them. Yes. You knew the one that helped me. I did. She turned away from the glass. In the corridor's lighter air, her skin was more lilac than gray, the undertone shifting with temperature the way it did, and her eyes in the overhead light were the color of old silver, deep and even. Why? She said. Why did you use it for me? I walked a few more steps before I answered, because I wanted to answer it correctly. Because you sat down in that corridor, and you held onto your bird and you waited for something to change. And I know what it is to be in a place where the systems around you have decided you don't fit into any of their categories, and where the correct response, according to those systems, is for you to stop existing in a convenient way. I have never found that response acceptable. I looked at the sentinels, their slow silver sweeping lights. And because I have spent 11 years learning the code specifically so that when something is worth doing, I can do it, it would have been a waste of 11 years not to. She didn't say anything else that night. But she walked the rest of the loop close enough that her shoulder was periodically near my arm, which for a Velhari is a gesture that sits somewhere between trust and gratitude, and does not translate precisely into anything humans say with words. There were other conversations across those months. Not many. Sarath was economical with language in the way that people are who have learned that words have consequences, that the wrong one said to the wrong ears can become records, can become the basis for a classification, can become something used against you. But she was not silent. She asked me about the code, not the mechanics of it but the intention, the original reasoning behind individual provisions, the human or non-human thinking that had produced a given rule. She had the quality of mind that does not accept a system at face value, that wants to understand not just what a rule says but why someone once decided it was necessary. I answered what I knew and acknowledged what I did not, which took some adjustment on my part. I had spent 11 years knowing the code in a particular professional way, as a set of tools, and Sarath's questions required me to think about it as a record of choices, which is different. On the 51st night, after I had been at my desk past midnight again, she came and sat in the chair beside me without asking and set the bird on the corner of the desk and watched me work for a while. After some time she said, "The form you filed on the first day, the one with the timestamp." "Yes." "You weren't certain it would work." I considered whether to answer that honestly. "No," I said. "I thought it was the right reading of the code. I wasn't certain the system would accept it." "But you filed it anyway." "It was the correct argument. Whether the system accepts a correct argument is the system's problem, not the argument's." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a strange way to think about it." "It's the only way I've found that doesn't make you compromise before you have to," I said. "If you only argue what you think you'll win, you've already let the system decide for you before you've opened your mouth. You make the correct argument. Then you see." She looked at the bird on the desk. Then she said, "In the hold there were others smaller than me." She paused. The pause had weight. She was choosing what to say and what to leave unsaid. "They took them somewhere different when we arrived." I stopped what I was doing and sat still. "You don't have to tell me this," I said. "I know," she said, "but someone should know that it happened." She set her hands flat on her knees, "that they were real." I did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that would be adequate. Then I said, "I'm going to write it down. Not in your file, in a separate report to the Outer Lane Transit Authority, with whatever details you can give me, so that it's on record, so that the next enforcement team that moves on that cell knows what to look for." She looked at me. "Will it help?" "I don't know," I said, "but someone should know." "That they were real." I repeated her words back to her because they were the right words and deserved to be repeated, so I'm going to write it down. She told me what she knew. I wrote it down. I filed the report the next morning through the appropriate channel with a notation that the information came from a protected source. Whether anything came of it, I never learned. But the document exists. That is something. The Regional Compliance Coordinator, Administrator Seth Havari, communicated exclusively through formal written notices in the Compact's most precise register, and she sent her most serious challenge on day 53. It was a motion to dismiss the provisional residency, filing on the grounds that Clause 7 Delta had been implicitly superseded by the General Provisions Reform Act of 11 years ago, which had reorganized the Code's entire approach to unclassified beings. The Reform Act had not explicitly repealed Clause 7 Delta. It had not mentioned it at all, but Havari's argument was that the Reform Act's comprehensive reorganization of the unclassified being provisions constituted an implicit supersession of all prior provisions dealing with the same subject matter, regardless of which section they lived in. It was a good argument. I acknowledged this to myself clearly, because in my experience the most dangerous arguments are the ones you underestimate. The implicit supersession doctrine is real and legitimate and has been used successfully to void legacy provisions in the Code before. Havari had found the argument I would have made if I had been on her side of the desk, which meant she was good at her job, and opposing someone good at their job requires more than confidence. I worked on my response for 4 days. I ate badly and slept in the annex most of those nights, reading the Reform Act's full legislative record, not just the act itself but the committee reports, the drafting notes, the floor arguments, the appended materials that most practitioners never opened because the act itself was clear enough for ordinary purposes. On the second night, Sarath appeared in the doorway of the supply room at past midnight and stood there looking at me surrounded by documents and said, without preamble, "You're tired." "Yes," I said. She crossed the room 6 steps and sat down in the chair beside my desk. She said nothing. She set the carved bird on the corner of my desk, in the narrow space between the document tray and the wall where I could see it without looking away from my work, and she folded her hands in her lap and was still. I went back to reading. I don't know that I can explain why it helped, her presence, the bird at the edge of my vision, the quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of someone who was completely there and had decided to be. It was something like ballast, the weight of a reason. I found what I needed in the appendix to the Reform Act, in a document that most practitioners would have stopped before reaching. The appendix contained a specific note from the drafting committee stating that the Reform Act's reorganization of Section 14 was intended to be comprehensive for that section, and that Section 7, legacy provisions, were explicitly preserved pending a Section 7 comprehensive review, which the committee intended to schedule within 2 years of the Act's passage. The review had not been scheduled. The 2 years had passed 11 years ago. The legacy provisions of Section 7, including Clause 7 Delta, were not merely unrepealed by the Reform Act. They had been explicitly preserved by the Reform Act's own legislative record. My response took 17 pages. I filed it on day 57. On day 68, the motion to dismiss was denied by the Administrative Review Board in a 2-sentence ruling that said only that the filing had been correctly executed, and the evidentiary record supported the Clause 7 Delta invocation. 2 sentences. 11 years of reading in service of 2 sentences, and it was exactly enough. Davesh came to my window that afternoon. He did not have the datapad. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before. Not admiration, not resentment, something more like the careful attention of a person who has just revised a working assumption. "You're going to get her classified," he said. "Yes, even after 90 days. The 90 days give me the time I need to file the permanent classification. I have the species registration, the health attestations, the origin jurisdiction argument, the trade agreement proviso, and a continuous residence record from day 1. The permanent application goes in on day 85. By the moment the provisional period expires, the permanent application is already in process, which creates a continuity bridge. There's a provision for that as well." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, not as a complaint, more as a genuine question, the first genuinely curious thing I had heard from him in 11 years. "Is this what you do when you think something is worth doing?" "The code is a large building," I said. "I've had 11 years to learn where the rooms are." He nodded once, short and precise, and left. The permanent classification application went in on day 84. I classified Sarath under a composite designation: recognized species subadult with frontier jurisdiction origin, provisionally classified as unaccompanied minor under documentation officer guardianship, which was a category I had assembled from existing components the way a person builds a shelter from what they can find on the ground, using each piece for its actual structural properties rather than its intended purpose. The guardianship component was the architectural key. It existed as a provision for documentation officers in frontier postings who encountered minors with incomplete records, and it had a regularization pathway that the standard compact classifications did not. Under the guardianship provision, Sarath's status was tied to mine for the provisional period, and then transitioned to independent standing once the permanent classification was confirmed. She would not be mine in any permanent sense. That was not the goal and would not have been the right outcome. She was Velhari and she had people somewhere, people the trafficking cell had separated her from, and finding them was a parallel process I had initiated on day 12, working through a Velhari advocacy network that operated in the outer lanes. The guardianship was a legal bridge, nothing more, but it was built from real materials, and it would hold her weight while the bridge to somewhere better was under construction. On day 91, one day after the provisional period formally closed, with the permanent classification active and the continuity bridge filed, Administrator Havari sent a final formal notice. It stated that the Regional Compliance Office had reviewed the complete file and found no actionable grounds for a removal order, and that pending resolution of the permanent classification proceedings, Sarath of Varath Station was recognized as a legal presence within the administrative boundary under documentation number 774 Velhari SD. 774 Velhari SD, a number, her number, the compact's acknowledgement in its own language that she was real. I read the notice 3 times, folded it precisely, and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I went to the supply room. Sarath was sitting on the cot with her knees drawn up, the carved bird in her hands, and she looked at me when I opened the door with the complete, still quality of attention she had always brought, as if she had been waiting but not anxiously, as if she had known roughly how it would come out. "It's done," I said. "You have a number. You're in the system. Nobody can remove you while the permanent proceedings are in process, and by the time those proceedings conclude you'll have been here long enough that the continuity arguments alone will hold." She looked at the carved bird, then she looked at me. "I was always real," she said. "You were," I said, "but now the building knows it." She thought about this with the quiet precision she brought to everything. "Then will I stay here?" "For a while longer. The advocates are working on finding your family. It may take time." "I know about waiting," she said. "I know, I've watched you do it." She got up from the cot and crossed the room and stood in front of me, and she pressed her forehead very briefly to my collarbone, which is the Velhari gesture for something that does not translate exactly into compact standard, but occupies the territory where gratitude and recognition and trust all meet, the acknowledgement that a person has seen you truly and you have seen them back. I put my hand on the back of her head, once lightly. That was all. She stayed at Varath Station for another 14 months while the Velhari Advocate Network traced her origin. She had come from a frontier settlement 3 transit lanes out, a small community displaced when the regional political arrangements had shifted in the way they shift in border zones, which is without warning and without particular regard for the beings inside. Her mother was alive. It took the advocates 8 months to find her, and 6 more to arrange a supervised transfer through channels legitimate enough to hold. The day they came for her, 2 Velhari adults, one of them her mother, a tall and spare woman with the same wide silver eyes who stood in my annex doorway and looked at me for a long moment before speaking, Sarath's mother said, in careful compact standard, "I am told you know the rules of this building." "Some of them," I said. "My daughter says you know all of them." "That's more than I'd claim." She looked at me with those silver eyes and said, "She would not be here to find if you had not used them." I did not have an answer to that. I said, "She waited very well, that was her." Sarath came to my window before she left. She was taller than she had been. 14 months is a long time at that age. Wearing proper Velhari clothing, her mother had brought deep gray-blue fabric that suited her skin's undertone better than anything the station had managed. She looked more herself in a way I had not been able to predict because I had not known, until I saw it, what more herself looked like. She set the carved bird on the counter between us. "You should have that," I said. "I'm going to come back for it," she said. "Keep it until I do." I picked it up. The wood was smooth from being held every day for 14 months. Her hands had worn it to a finish no woodworker could have put on it. I set it in the corner of my desk, between the document tray and the wall. That was 15 years ago. I am still at Verath Station. The work is the same work: manifests, transit logs, the great slow architecture of the compact's administrative body, which has been reformed several times since and has acquired new provisions and retired old ones. Though not, I note, Clause 7 Delta, which was formally revised in the 13th year. It was expanded rather than repealed. The provisional period was extended from 90 days to 120, and the grade requirement for invoking officers was changed from grade 3 to grade 2, making it accessible to more of the people who might need it. Some other administrator at some other station had found a reason to use it, and the revision had followed. 3 weeks ago, I received a notification from the Compact's Legal Observer Corps, a reform institution established 6 years ago to provide independent oversight of administrative processes in border zones. The notification said that a legal observer would be visiting Verath Station on a routine review, and requested that the documentation annex prepare its procedural records for examination. I prepared the records. I am always prepared. She came through the main transit corridor on a Thursday morning, in the gray-blue uniform of the Observer Corps with the badge on her lapel. She was tall and spare, ashen lilac skin and wide silver eyes and the pointed ears of her people, and she carried a satchel and a datapad, and the expression of someone who takes their work seriously, which is a quality I have always found easy to work with. She came to my window. She set the carved wooden bird on the counter between us. I looked at it for a moment. It was the same bird, rough carving, worn smooth, kept in someone's pocket for 15 years the same way I had kept it in the corner of my desk. She had come back for it when she said she would, and she had kept it the same way. I looked up at her. "Legal Observer Sarath," she said formally, because she was here on official business and she understood what that meant. "I'm here to examine Verath Station's documentation procedures." "Then you'll want to start with Section 7 of the Code," I said. "I've been told it's where some of the more interesting provisions live." The corner of her mouth moved. "I looked up the administrator who wrote Clause 7 Delta," she said. "He left a note in the Legislative Archive, a personal one, not a formal document. He said he wrote it because he kept seeing cases come through the boundary that the Code didn't have a word for, and he was tired of watching the Code treat its own silence as permission." I thought about the annex and the manifests, and 11 years before this morning and 15 since. I thought about a small ashen lilac girl sitting in a service corridor with a carved bird in her hands, waiting for something to change with her attention completely intact. "He sounds like he understood the building," I said. "He does," said Sarath. "I thought you'd want to know." She picked up her datapad, opened her case file, and we got to work. The forms she needed to examine were all in order. I had kept them in order for 15 years because that is the work and the work does not stop, and there is a particular satisfaction in doing it correctly that has nothing to do with whether anyone notices. She was thorough. She asked the right questions, which did not surprise me. She took notes in a hand I recognized as Velhari-influenced, small, precise, economical, and she did not miss anything I could see her looking for. By midday, she had covered more ground than the last 3 observer inspections combined. At the end of the day, before she left, she picked up the carved bird from the counter and held it for a moment. The wood was worn smooth, mine from 15 years of being near it, hers from 15 years before that. Then she tucked it into her jacket pocket, the same way I had always imagined she would carry it. "I'll be back next cycle," she said. "Section 7 has a few more provisions worth examining." "I'll have the relevant files ready," I said. She nodded once, the human nod, not the Velhari tilt, which told me she had learned to move between them and did so without thinking, and walked back through the transit corridor and out into the station beyond. I watched her go. Then I turned back to the manifests on my desk, which were the usual tangle, and I picked up my stylus, and I got back to work.